Late winter, 1944. Berlin is cold enough that breath hangs in hallways, and the city's daylight feels thin, more like a dim filter than a sun. On maps pinned to walls across the capital, the Reich is still drawn in bold lines. In the air above it, those lines are being erased hour by hour. The warning system has become a metronome: sirens, phones, runners, another report of formations crossing the coast, another estimate of altitude and heading, another set of dots turning into a stream, then into several streams, then into something that no single staff officer can hold in his head. By now, it isn't just bombs that frighten planners. It's the rhythm, the knowledge that tomorrow will look like today, and the day after that, and that every German response, fighters, flak ammunition, rail repair crews, fuel trains, must be paid for from reserves that do not refill at the same speed. This is what prolonged fighting against American power begins to feel like: not one decisive blow, but an endless accounting, until the numbers stop obeying willpower, and that accounting had been building for years. To understand what Hitler misjudged, you have to step back before America's uniforms were common in Europe, to a moment when the war still looked, at least from Berlin, like something that could be finished fast enough to outrun consequences. In 1940, Germany's victories were swift and theatrical. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway were seized. Then the blow in the West, May-June 1940, collapsed France with a speed that stunned the world. The Wehrmacht's operational art, concentrated armor, and coordinated air-ground assault had created an image of invincibility, but it also created a habit: the belief that the war's problems could be solved with one more campaign, one more gamble, one more shock. Britain's refusal to surrender after Dunkirk forced the first long-term dilemma. Germany could not easily invade across the Channel without air superiority, and the Battle of Britain showed that air superiority was not a switch Berlin could simply flip. Yet even then, Hitler's strategic thinking kept circling back to the same promise: that Britain would eventually crack through blockade pressure, bombing, political exhaustion, or isolation. Across the Atlantic, the United States was not yet in the war, but it was already moving. The American economy had been wounded by the Depression, but it retained something no European power could suddenly invent under fire: depth. In factories, raw materials, machine tools, and a population base large enough to staff both industry and armed forces. By 1940-41, American rearmament programs and aid to Britain were expanding. Lend-Lease would soon turn from policy into shipping manifests: planes, trucks, food, fuel, and ammunition crossing the ocean in quantities that made strategy feel physical. Hitler's misjudgment wasn't a failure to notice America's size. It was the way he translated that size into time. He treated American power as a kind of distant storm: large, real, but slow to arrive, and therefore something that could be avoided by winning quickly in Europe. That assumption shaped the biggest decision of all: Operation Barbarossa, launched on 22 June 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not simply an Eastern campaign. It was a wager that the war could be ended by smashing the USSR before Britain could gain strength, before American production could fully mobilize, and before Germany's enemies could synchronize. Barbarossa was built on the logic of a short war: quick encirclements, rapid advances, the enemy collapsing before winter. The plan required speed because Germany's resources, especially oil, were not designed for an industrial war of attrition against the combined weight of multiple great powers. But the summer and autumn of 1941 did not bring collapse. The Soviet state absorbed disasters and kept fighting. The front lengthened into thousands of miles. Losses became hard to hide inside communiques. Winter arrived, and Germany found itself in the very condition it had tried to avoid: a war that demanded not just operational brilliance, but replacement. Month after month, machines, fuel, trained crews, and time. By the end of 1941, the idea of finishing the war before American power mattered was already slipping. And then Berlin made it official. On 11 December 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler removed any remaining ambiguity by declaring war on the United States. In strict military terms, it was a decision that traded a manageable risk for a permanent one. It turned American involvement from a growing material presence into a full-spectrum enemy commitment, ships, aircraft, soldiers, and an economy reorganized for a fight that would not be timed by European patience. At first, the mismatch between American potential and American readiness still looked like a window. In 1941, the U.S. Army was comparatively small for a global war. Many units were new. Equipment was uneven. Doctrine was still being tested, but America's advantage was never about being ready on day one. It was about being able to get better, then get bigger, without breaking. The change began to show in 1942, not as a single surge, but as a multiplying effect. Factories converted. New plants came online. Training camps filled. Shipyards began producing merchant hulls at a tempo that treated the ocean like a supply line rather than a barrier. The Atlantic, which Germany hoped would become a choke point, became its own contest of endurance. U-boats hunting tonnage, Allied escorts, aircraft patrols, radar, and convoy discipline adapting month by month. The early months were dangerous, sinkings were heavy, and the learning curve was paid for in lives and cargo, but the direction of travel mattered more than the daily headlines. The Allies were building a system that improved under pressure. By late 1942, American forces were appearing in large operations in the European theater, most visibly with Operation Torch in North Africa. It wasn't the biggest front, but it was a signal. The United States was not simply supplying the war, it was entering it with formations, command structures, and the logistical habit of moving men and machines across oceans and sustaining them there. Meanwhile, the air war was shifting from raids into a sustained campaign. The United States expanded its heavy bomber force in Britain, feeding crews, aircraft, spare parts, and fuel into a machine designed for repetition. Germany could shoot down planes. It could kill experienced crews, but it could not easily stop the pipeline itself. Not without air superiority it no longer reliably held, and not while its own resources were being pulled east, then pulled back west, then pulled again. By 1943, the war had begun to resemble what Hitler had tried to avoid, a contest where victory depended on whether a nation could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. In the Atlantic, U-boat successes met tightening defenses and rising escort strength. In the skies, German fighter units were forced into continual attrition, and attrition is cruelest to the side training slower. On the ground, the Eastern Front consumed men and material at a rate that made every shortage elsewhere more lethal. This is the environment Hitler misjudged. Not America's existence, the WWII is distance, but the way America's power, once fully committed, would expand into every seam of the German war effort: sea lanes, skies, factories, fuel depots, and pilot schools, until the war became a set of angles all pointing in the same direction. Hitler understood battles. He understood shock. He understood what happened when one army broke another's front. What he misjudged was what happened when the enemy's true strength was not a formation at the front, but a pipeline behind it. Machines, trained crews, fuel, spare parts, and shipping space arriving in steady waves. American power did not rely on one brilliant season. It relied on repetition. A bomber shot down over Germany was not only a loss, it was a request for another airframe, another crew, another set of engines, another crate of parts, another ton of aviation fuel. In Germany, each replacement became harder as the war dragged on, because factories were increasingly disrupted, skilled labor thinned, transport networks strained, and critical materials competed with each other. In the United States, replacement was the system's purpose. Assembly lines were built to keep moving. Training bases kept producing crews. Shipyards kept sliding hulls into the water. The war became an equation where destruction mattered less than who could absorb it. This is why prolonged war changed the meaning of German success. Even a tactically perfect defense could become strategically useless if it cost pilots faster than they could be trained, or burned fuel faster than it could be refined and delivered. Germany could still achieve local victories. But local victories don't end a war when the opposing side can replace entire categories of loss faster than you can replace one squadron's experience. Hitler gambled on short war because Germany's economy and resource base were not built for a long duel against multiple industrial giants. Once the United States fully committed, time stopped being neutral. It became a force, quiet, mechanical, and relentless, turning American capacity into pressure that increased every month. Germany's most realistic way to limit American power was not to fight it head-on in Europe at first, but to starve the bridge that connected America to the war. That bridge was the Atlantic. If cargo ships couldn't reach Britain and the Soviet Union, American production would remain potential, stacked in warehouses, useless to a battlefield an ocean away. The U-boat campaign was built around that logic, and early on it was dangerous. Convoys lost ships. Crews died in cold water. Tonnage sank faster than headlines could count it. But prolonged war revealed a crucial difference. The Atlantic was not just a hunting ground. It was an adaptive system. Convoy tactics tightened, escort numbers rose, coastal blackouts and routing improved. New technologies spread, better radar, high-frequency direction finding, improved sonar, and expanded long-range air patrols that closed the air gap, where submarines once operated more freely. Intelligence and coordination improved as well, turning the Atlantic from scattered defense into managed protection. By spring 1943, the balance shifted sharply. U-boat losses climbed to levels that were hard to sustain, and the German command was forced to pull back from some of the most contested routes. The sea lanes did not become safe overnight, but they became reliable enough. And reliability is what American scale needed. Once shipping space was secured, America could move not only weapons, but entire armies, their fuel, their trucks, their replacement parts, and their food across the ocean in a continuous flow. That is the nightmare of prolonged fighting. You don't just face an enemy. You face an enemy who can reach you again and again in increasing strength because the ocean no longer protects you. And once the bridge is stable, the next pressure point is the sky. For Germany, the air war became the most revealing demonstration of what American power meant in prolonged fighting because it forced the Reich to defend everywhere at once, on a schedule the enemy controlled. American daylight bombing doctrine was costly, and early raids proved that courage alone could not substitute for protection. But prolonged war is where doctrine is either corrected or abandoned. The United States could afford to learn, because its losses, while painful, did not end its ability to return tomorrow. Over time, American fighter escort range improved, and long-range escorts increasingly denied the Luftwaffe the one advantage it needed: the ability to concentrate against bomber streams and escape intact. Every interception cost fuel and pilot hours. Every failed interception cost factories and rail lines. And the targets were not random. As the campaign matured, the pressure shifted toward systems that made German war production possible: aircraft assembly, ball bearings and machine tool nodes, transport hubs, and, most critically, fuel. Germany's war machine ran on refined petroleum products that were never plentiful. The longer the war lasted, the more every panzer movement, every training flight, every scramble order became a withdrawal from a shrinking bank account. This is where Hitler's misjudgment becomes structural. He treated air defense like a tactical contest: shoot down enough bombers, disrupt enough raids, and the enemy will lose heart. But American power was not a single formation that could be frightened away. It was an industrial and training ecosystem that could keep producing airframes and crews. Germany could kill aircraft. It could not easily replace experienced pilots, and it could not conjure fuel out of ideology. In a prolonged war, the Luftwaffe's problem stopped being bravery or even design. It became arithmetic. Fewer trained men, less fuel, and an enemy that returned with increasing escort strength and better coordination. Hitler also misjudged American power because he imagined it as a standalone opponent, an American army arriving late to a European war. In reality, American power acted like a multiplier for everyone fighting Germany. Britain provided bases, maritime experience, and a strategic position that allowed sustained air operations. The Soviet Union absorbed and inflicted enormous land warfare losses on the Eastern Front, forcing Germany to keep millions of men and vast quantities of equipment engaged in a grinding struggle of survival. When American production and shipping began flowing at full speed, it didn't replace these pressures, it reinforced them. That is what prolonged war does to a state fighting multiple enemies. It forces choices that are all bad. Reinforce the East and the West grows stronger. Guard the West and the East bleeds. Build fighters and tanks suffer. Build tanks and air defense weakens. Prioritize transport repair, and frontline units go short of equipment. Every decision becomes a trade-off inside a shrinking resource pool. Coalition warfare also created strategic timing Germany could not control. The Allies could plan sequentially, choosing where to apply major force while maintaining pressure elsewhere. North Africa and Italy forced German deployments and consumed resources. The Strategic Air Campaign demanded constant defense. The Eastern Front demanded constant reinforcement. And when the time came for a decisive return to France, it would arrive not as a single spear, but as a mass of men and material transported across a secured ocean and supported by air superiority. This is the essence of what Hitler misjudged. America did not merely bring soldiers. It brought the ability to sustain Allied pressure, turning Germany's war into a continuous emergency with no quiet seasons. And by 1944, that emergency would reach a point where the system itself began to fail. 20th February 1944, Central Germany, before noon. The winter sky is pale and hard, and the contrails form long, straight seams that refuse to drift away. In German fighter control rooms, plotted tracks overlap until the boards look less like airspace and more like weather. Multiple streams, multiple altitudes, arriving on schedules too dense to untangle. This is not a raid meant to scare. It is a campaign meant to exhaust. The Americans call it Big Week, a sustained series of attacks running 20-25 February 1944. And it is aimed at the structure that keeps Germany in the air. Aircraft assembly plants, component production, and the wider industrial web that feeds the Luftwaffe. The U.S. 8th Air Force flies out of Britain, while the 15th Air Force presses from Italy, forcing German defenses into a geometry they can't simplify. When the bombers appear, they do not come alone. Escort fighters, especially long-range types now appearing in strength, stretch the battle outward, away from the target and into the approaches, turning interception into a running fight that begins earlier and ends later. For the Luftwaffe, every decision carries a cost. Commit fighters aggressively and lose them where they can't be recovered. Hold back and watch factories take hits that cannot be repaired fast enough. Scramble repeatedly and burn fuel and engine hours that don't come back. Send up the best pilots and risk the one resource Germany cannot mass produce: trained experience. In the air, the pattern becomes grimly familiar. German fighters climb to meet bomber formations, then find themselves drawn into combat not only with defensive guns, but with escorts that stay longer, range farther, and return tomorrow. Bombers fall, whole crews lost in seconds. Yet the raids continue, and the pressure spreads across days rather than peaking once. The Luftwaffe can still inflict damage, but prolonged fighting changes what damage means. The Americans can accept losses and still regenerate. Germany cannot accept the steady depletion of pilots, aircraft, and maintenance capacity, while also fighting a land war in the east and holding a threatened coastline in the west. Inside the Reich's war economy, the effects don't arrive as one dramatic collapse. They arrive as delays, dispersals, bottlenecks. A plant hit today forces production to move, and moving production costs time and precision. Dispersal protects some machinery, but strains transport and coordination. Repairs require skilled hands pulled from somewhere else, and every shift that saves one piece of the system exposes another. The campaign's purpose is not only to destroy what exists, it is to make the act of replacing what is destroyed slower than the act of destroying it again. By the end of that week, the Luftwaffe is still flying, but its margin is thinner, its best men harder to replace, its fuel and spare parts more precious, and its ability to surge against the next wave more uncertain. The sky over Germany begins to feel less like a battlefield that can be won, and more like a tax that must be paid daily, in aircraft and in men. And when a nation loses control of its own airspace, everything beneath it, rail, bridges, depots, troop movements, becomes exposed to pressure that never has to pause. That exposure is what makes the next step possible. Not another raid, but a return to France under an umbrella Germany can no longer reliably tear open. 6th June 1944. The English Channel is not rough enough to stop an invasion, but it is rough enough to punish mistakes. Before dawn, the sea carries a low, continuous engine noise. Thousands of vessels moving in disciplined lanes, lights blacked out, crews watching the horizon as if staring might hold it still. The first violence is not on the beaches, it is in the dark inland. In the early hours, airborne troops drop behind the coast, men and equipment scattered by wind and flak, landing in flooded fields, hedgerows and farm lanes that smell of wet earth and summer grass. Small groups gather by whispered names and hand signals, bridges, crossroads, causeways. The mission is simple in concept and brutal in execution. Keep the exits open, disrupt the enemy's movement, and hold long enough for the sea to deliver the real weight. Out at sea, the fleet closes the final miles. Naval guns begin their work with a rhythm that feels industrial, not heroic. Salvos timed, corrected, repeated. Then the landing craft begin to peel away from the larger ships and head for the shore in waves that do not stop. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, names that will become shorthand for entire human experiences, receive their first impact in different ways, at different costs, under the same larger condition. The Allies are arriving inside a sky that Germany can no longer fully own. German commanders on the ground still have men who can fight. They still have units trained for counterattack. They still have guns that can turn steel into torn water and broken bodies. But the decisive difference is not bravery. It is mobility under air pressure. When German reserves try to move in daylight, they move beneath hostile fighters and fighter bombers hunting roads, rail junctions, and columns. A battalion that could have been decisive at the right hour becomes delayed, scattered, forced off roads, compelled to hide, compelled to arrive late and incomplete. In a shorter war, that might be survivable. In a prolonged war, time is what the enemy sells in bulk. On the beaches, the fight is intimate. Obstacles, mines, machine gun fire, ash, smoke, confusion, men trying to read landmarks through dust and salt spray. Some sectors break open faster, others stall and bleed. The critical fact is that the landings do not need perfection. They need persistence, and persistence is what American power supplies. Every hour that a foothold exists, more arrives. Engineers, radios, artillery, medical teams, fuel, ammunition, bulldozers, spare parts. The shoreline is turned into a working surface, then into a port substitute, then into a growing machine that converts sea space into land power. This is the moment Hitler's prolonged war misjudgment becomes irreversible. A defense can defeat a raid. It can blunt an attack. It can even throw an enemy back into the sea, if the enemy's flow is thin and fragile. But here the flow is not thin. It is engineered, protected by sea control, enabled by air superiority, and sustained by an industrial system that treats loss as a problem to be replaced, not a signal to stop. By nightfall, the Allies have not won the war on a map, but they have done the one thing Germany could least afford. They have established a Western front that will grow stronger every day, while German resources grow weaker every day. The question now is not whether the pressure will continue, but how fast Germany's whole system begins to fracture under it. In the weeks after 6 June 1944, Germany's problem is no longer simply stop the landing. It is that the war has become a contest of throughput, how fast each side can push men, fuel, ammunition, and replacements into the decisive space, and how long they can keep doing it without their system cracking. For the Allies, the beachhead is not a symbol. It is a construction site. Engineers carve exits through obstacles. Road nets are widened. Wrecks are dragged aside. Temporary facilities appear where there used to be sand and hedgerows. Supplies come in as a steady flow. Food, medical stores, artillery rounds, gasoline, spare parts, because the sea lanes hold, and because the logistical planning treats time as something you manufacture through organization. For Germany, every answer becomes harder to deliver. Moving reserves toward Normandy is not just a matter of orders. It is a problem of survival under air attack. Columns that attempt daylight movement invite strikes. Bridges and rail junctions become danger points. Trains are delayed, rerouted, halted, repaired, delayed again. The results are seen at the front as something almost humiliating in its simplicity. Units arrive late, tired, with missing vehicles, missing fuel, missing cohesion. Even when German soldiers fight skillfully on the ground, they do it inside a shrinking envelope of support. The air war tightens the vice. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest Allied air power is limited by two things that prolonged war makes fatal: trained pilots and fuel. Pilot losses cannot be replaced quickly with equivalent experience. Fuel shortages don't just slow tanks, they reduce training hours, cut operational flying, and turn air defense into a rationed privilege. Germany can still strike back in places, but it cannot maintain the constant presence needed to change the overall balance. The sky becomes less a battlefield and more an environment the Allies control. Inside Germany's war economy, the response becomes increasingly desperate and increasingly inefficient. Production is dispersed to protect it, but dispersal strains transport and management. Repairs are made, but repairs require materials and labor and uninterrupted movement, exactly what the bombing and the advancing fronts are eroding. Weapons still roll out, but the system feeding them, rails, refineries, depots, trained crews, begins to fail faster than output can compensate. This is the consequence Hitler misjudged when he accepted prolonged war against American power. The United States could afford a long learning curve and still expand, while Germany's margin for error kept shrinking. By late summer 1944, the Western Front is no longer a temporary emergency. It is a permanent drain, one that grows stronger each day. While Germany's ability to respond grows weaker, measured in fuel, movement, and the fading ability to choose where to fight next. By late 1944, the war against Germany no longer runs on a single front or a single crisis. It runs on simultaneity, pressures arriving together, reinforcing each other, leaving fewer places to hide. In the East, the Soviet summer offensives, especially Operation Bagration, beginning 22 June 1944, tear open entire army groups and force Germany into retreats that consume vehicles, fuel, and trained formations. In the West, the Normandy campaign expands into a breakout, then into a rapid advance that turns France into a corridor for Allied logistics and airfields. These fronts are not separate problems. They are connected by the same fragile arteries: rails, depots, refineries, and the dwindling pool of experienced manpower that keeps complex weapons systems alive. Above everything, the air war keeps tightening. By 1944, Allied bombing pressure increasingly targets oil and transport, the parts of the German system that can't be substituted with ideology or improvisation. Synthetic fuel facilities and refineries, once damaged, don't simply bounce back. Repairs demand time, specialized equipment, stable rail delivery, and uninterrupted work. Exactly what a sustained air campaign denies. When fuel supply collapses, it doesn't only slow tanks at the front. It reduces pilot training hours. It limits fighter patrols. It turns air defense into a rationing problem. And every time the Luftwaffe flies less, Allied aircraft fly more freely, which further punishes transport, which further weakens fuel distribution. It becomes a loop that closes on itself. Germany's leadership searches for escapes in weapons and gambles. New rockets and jet prototypes appear, but they cannot alter the central equation. Advanced systems still require fuel, parts, skilled labor, and protected production, and prolonged war has stripped Germany of all four. Even when these weapons achieve local shock, they do not stop armies, rebuild rail networks, or reopen refineries. The last great gamble in the West, the Ardennes offensive, launched 16 December 1944, shows the full cost of Hitler's misjudgment. It depends on speed, surprise, and captured fuel. It seeks to fracture Allied cohesion before American power can fully absorb the shock. But prolonged war is exactly what gives the Allies resilience. When weather clears, Allied air power returns over the battlefield. Fuel shortages bite. German units slow, then stall, then bleed away men and vehicles they can no longer replace. By early 1945, the German war effort is fighting inside a collapsing infrastructure. Rail lines are severed and repaired and severed again. Units are assembled with uneven training and mismatched equipment. Command decisions become less about strategy and more about crisis management under scarcity. The Allies cross the Rhine in force in March 1945, while Soviet forces drive toward Berlin. The end comes not as a single dramatic break, but as a system that can no longer move, supply, or regenerate itself. This is what Hitler misjudged about prolonged fighting against American power. It didn't require one perfect victory. It required endurance. And endurance was the one resource Germany could not manufacture fast enough once the United States turned time into pressure. When people look back at the Second World War, they often search for a single hinge. One battle, one decision, one day when fate turned. But the misjudgment at the heart of prolonged fighting against American power is quieter than that. It is the belief that modern war is still primarily a contest of nerve and brilliance, when it has become, just as often, a contest of systems. Hitler built his strategy around speed because Germany's strengths rewarded speed. Operational surprise, concentrated force, campaigns designed to end before the enemy could adapt. That approach created spectacular early victories, and it trained Berlin to think of time as something you could seize rather than something you had to survive. In that mindset, America looked like a distant weight, huge but slow, rich but politically hesitant, powerful but not yet shaped for war. What prolonged fighting revealed was that American power was never only an army, it was a method, a national talent for turning industry into field strength, shipping into strategy, and learning into scale. The United States could lose ships and build more. It could lose aircraft and train more crews. It could suffer defeats and still expand. And because it fought as part of a coalition, that expansion did not arrive into an empty theater. It arrived into a war already absorbing German resources in the east, already contested at sea, already bleeding through air defense and transport. Prolonged war also exposed what ideology cannot fix. No speech can refine fuel. No decree can create experienced pilots overnight. No willpower can move divisions on shattered rails under hostile skies. In the end, the Reich did not simply run out of men or run out of courage. It ran out of the hidden things that make modern armies function: spare parts, training hours, repair capacity, and time. That is why the winter of 1944 in Berlin felt like an accounting, not a mystery. The war had become a ledger, and the numbers were no longer moving in Germany's favor. Hitler misjudged prolonged fighting against American power because he believed the war could be won before the full weight arrived. But once that weight was committed, and once the war lasted long enough for it to mature, there was no single counterstroke left that could reverse the arithmetic. And in that cold Berlin air, with sirens returning again and again, the future stopped being a question of hope and became a question of endurance that Germany could no longer afford.